We'll get going. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this great book launch for Global Migration, Gender, and Health Professional Credentials. This is an event being hosted by the Migration, Mobilities, and Social Politics Research Cluster at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. The Balsillie School is located on the traditional territory of the Arawandran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And this is part of the Haldimand Tract, which is land promised to 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. I'd like to acknowledge that settler colonial processes on these lands are ongoing, and encourage each of us to think about the ways that we can act towards decolonization through our work and through our learning in our event today. So I'd like to start by introducing the speakers. First, we have the MMSP co-lead, Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts. And Margaret is a human geographer who's a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and also at the Balsillie School. And she is the editor of the book that we're discussing today. Our next speaker is John Ravenhill. John is chair of the political science department at the University of Waterloo, and also the former director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. We have as well today Arthur Sweetman. Arthur is a professor in the Department of Economics at McMaster University, and he holds an Ontario Research Chair in Health Human Resources. Our next speaker is Ivy Bourgeot. Pardon me, Ivy, if I pronounced your name wrong. And Ivy is professor in the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies at the University of Ottawa. And she is University Research Chair in Gender, Diversity, and the Professions. And last but not least, we have Abel Chikanda. Abel is an associate professor in the School of Earth, Environmental, and Society at McMaster University. So I would like to turn it over to Margaret, who will introduce the book, and then each of our speakers will have some time to discuss their contributions. So Margaret, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. I'm just checking that we're good on the slides. Excellent. So thank you, Sarah. Sarah is also the co-director of MMSP with me, the Migration, Mobility and Social Politics Research Cluster. And I'm very pleased and grateful for the opportunity for this book launch for research that's very much at the core of the work of MMSP and others. And I'm very grateful to the other panelists for joining me in this discussion, and thank you to the audience for joining us. So the book is published with the University of Toronto Press. It's called Global Migration, Gender and Health Professional Credentials. It's an edited collection. These are always a lot of work and really a collaborative effort. And so I'm really grateful to all of the contributors. And I will go through just briefly what the book addresses, why it's timely, and who contributed to it. So the collection really does bring together diverse approaches, international case studies. We examine health worker migration and really think about the issue of how we transfer value in terms of the kinds of skills and educational resources that are invested in these essential personnel. And so the key objective was to try and offer a new analytical framework that really understands this notion of embodied value, and also attended to all of the intersectionality that is kind of wrapped up in these experiences and processes. So the work began in 2017 with a workshop, and you may think, well, that was 5 years ago. And in fact, this book is more timely than ever. Funnily enough, because after the pandemic, what we've seen now is this rising demand for healthcare workers. We've seen the NHS turning back to its old kind of colonial linkages in its post-Brexit phase, massive demand for healthcare workers there. We've seen the US very much turning back again to recruiting international healthcare workers, especially nurses. Germany is now an important recruiter for healthcare workers, especially nurses, considering the demands they have, especially in the elder care sector. And Australia and New Zealand, always recruiters of healthcare worker migrants. In terms of Canada, we've seen various provinces just recently start to announce recruitment strategies in order to bolster their healthcare workforces. We've seen Ontario move towards registration changes to enhance and speed up the credential recognition of foreign educated healthcare workers who reside in the province. PEI has announced its strategy to recruit and support foreign health trained workers, as has British Columbia. And so the book is really timely in this regard, and the contributions to it make a number of contributions to our kind of analytical engagement on this issue. The first and most important is it tries to forge dialogue between economistic and feminist concepts of global value transition, thinking about care, how we value care, how we understand the way in which we integrate workers into healthcare systems. It also theorizes from different locations in terms of this particular phenomena, tries to also escape methodological nationalism by understanding the deeply international dimensions of health worker mobility and serial mobility, multi-step mobility. It wants to recognize the increasing dynamism of this process and the geographical complexity that we are witnessing. And it attends to the embodied and embedded nature of value transfer and, importantly, stratification into workplaces. And we attempt to escape methodological sexism. We understand about how care has been devalued. We understand what this means in terms of the recognition of workers in the sector. We want to pay attention to intersectional complexity in the integration of health and allied workers. The book it consists of 5 sections, looking at global value transfer. We look at new approaches and challenges. We conceptualize workplace integration. We think about transnational health mobilities. We think about particular domestic policies in different countries. And then we kind of recast a perennial debate in this sphere, which is the idea of brain drain. There are a number of scholars who contributed wonderful chapters, and I'm grateful to all of them for what they have done and for the work that they do. For this particular workshop, at first we wondered if it would be in person, and so I did turn to my colleagues here in southwestern Ontario. So I'm very grateful to John Ravenhill, who helped provide a kind of conceptualization framing from the first. In the first chapter, then Arthur Sweetman, whose excellent work on foreign immigrant credentials in the healthcare professions, has gratefully, generously agreed to present. And then Ivy Bourgeot and her colleagues, who've been doing amazing work on the health professions. And so she has been very central to this work, and I'm grateful to Ivy for contributing. And then I'm really pleased to be able to invite Abel Shikanda to present, because Abel is a colleague from the Balsillie School, a good friend who had been away at Kansas, and he has since returned and is now also at McMaster. So I'm very pleased that these individuals have agreed to present, and their work reflects some of the interest, looking at it from a conceptual perspective, then looking at very Canadian particular issues, and then Abel offers us some analysis of the role of intermediaries in the process. So I'm grateful to the panelists for agreeing to present on their work. I'm also grateful to all of the other authors who presented, some of whom may be here, some of whom will be hopefully able to watch a recording because they're in time zones scattered all over the world. I'm also very grateful to the assistance that was provided in the long period of time through which this book was formulated. So the Balsillie School, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Wilfrid Laurier University, they all provided funding to assist in the process. The IMRC, which has always been a centre for collaborative engagement and mutual support, which I've always found so generous and important to my work. The University of Toronto Press was wonderful to work with, and I'm very appreciative to them, especially Jodie Luchuk, who worked with us. and the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences, who provided funding in the form of the assistance to scholarly publications. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to John Ravenhill to begin our exploration. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Margaret. A special thanks to Margaret for all of the work that she's put into this project. You'll have seen from that list of sponsors that it's been a major act of coordination. It's a huge book. It's a very important book. It's been a pleasure to be involved in this, and Margaret has just put so much work into successfully guiding this manuscript to a very important publication. I was also grateful to Margaret for inviting me to participate because, at first sight, this really doesn't seem to be a natural fit for me because I'm a political economist. I've worked on value chains for several decades, but I mean, for me, the great thing about this project, besides learning an enormous amount from other contributors, was that it encouraged me to look at literatures that I previously was not familiar with. So today, I'll briefly discuss the global value chain concept and then attempt to review how the questions raised in this literature are relevant to the study of migration, gender, and health. So the concept of what is now commonly known as global value chains had its origin in the work of world systems theorists in the 1970s, which focused on what they called global commodity chains. But as companies adopted a new business model in which component production and/or assembly was increasingly outsourced to third parties, the study of global value chains took off. And this embraced various disciplines, including geography, economics, sociology, and political science. By the end of the first decade of this century, global value chains were arguably the primary focus of research on international development. And all of the major international agencies were trying to find ways in which developing economies could more effectively participate in these value chains. So part of the academic work was concerned with a simple mapping of what was going on and understanding the new geographical division of labor. But the classic political science question of who gets what, when, and how was also central to this literature. A key focus was on relationships between companies in the value chains and how the skills of local firms in developing economies might be upgraded. Curiously, despite the emphasis on development, people largely disappeared from this analysis. The literature has been criticized for making the assumption that the benefits of upgrading to firms will trickle down to their workers. But there's ample evidence that a change of ownership, a move, say, from production by a subsidiary of a transnational corporation to production by a local company, will not necessarily lead to better working conditions. Hence, in recent years, much more attention has been given in the literature to what has been referred to as, quote, social upgrading, unquote. How do you improve the living standards of workers? With the internet revolution, services also increasingly became organized on a transnational basis. Call centers, software design, accountancy services, etc., were outsourced. Now, for some commentators, this transnationalization of services offered greater opportunities for developing economies because arguably there are lower startup costs in services than in manufacturing. It's easier to enter this sector than to build a very complex manufacturing plant. Ease of entry, however, means that there is potentially greater competition amongst developing economies. It's easier to get into this, and so therefore there's a risk of oversupply driving the price down. And when one deals with value chains, it always has to be remembered that the foundation of the business model of outsourcing is that it is the least profitable parts of the value chain that companies want to outsource. So you're competing for the least profitable segments of the value chain. Apple doesn't manufacture. It gets its value from its research and design, from its distribution, from its brand name. So that is where the value added overwhelmingly comes from, rather than the manufacturing side of things. Now, that's not to say there are no gains for developing economies or their labor forces from participating in these value chains, but the challenge everywhere is to increase the local share of the value added in the entire chain. These service sectors that I initially mentioned there, call centers, accountancy, etc., predominantly involved a transfer of the product internationally, whereas labor was immobile. The call center was located in the foreign country. There was one sector, however, where labor moved internationally, to which a very interesting literature applied global value chain analysis. And that was the production of soccer players in Africa for European leagues, and of baseball players in the Caribbean for the major leagues in North America. The analogy with manufacturing is imperfect. So leaving aside the issue, and it's an important issue, of whether it's appropriate to refer to humans as commodities, a key difference from manufacturing is that the emphasis is on the development of unique skills of these players, rather than a homogeneous product. And unlike widgets or iPhones, human beings have agency. What can be drawn from this literature that is relevant to the global migration of health professionals? Well, as with professional sports people, one has to address the appropriateness of a commodity-based metaphor. On the other hand, in contrast to the development of footballers or baseball players, professional development leading to the certification of a particular level of proficiency in the health professions is much more akin to the production of a homogenized commodity. You want people with the same skills, the same certification. Now, education brings social as well as private benefits. In the Philippines, of course, one of the major sources of migrant nurses. These social benefits include overseas remittances, which account for just under 10% of the country's GDP, and 1/3 of the value of exports of goods and services. There's a very good chapter on the Philippines in the book, which I encourage everyone to take a look at. Now, the questions that are central to the global value chain literature can be posed when it comes to health care professionals. Where is the value added captured? How can more value added be captured locally? What role can the state play in local upgrading? What policy instruments can effectively ensure that states recoup the investment of scarce resources in training professionals? Should higher fees be charged, for instance, to those receiving training, or should the whole process be privatized? Should there be obligations imposed on beneficiaries to work domestically for a specific period before they are permitted to emigrate? Can one build in an obligation on migrants to return at least temporarily to share their skills? Can international agreements, whether at the global level, such as the WHO Global Code of Practice on the international recruitment of health personnel, or through bilateral trade agreements, ensure that the balance of benefits from migration of medical professionals be more evenly shared between supplying and recipient countries? Now, I wouldn't pretend to have the answers to these questions. My fellow panelists are much better equipped to do this than I am. But at least the global value chain literature does signpost, I would suggest, the relevant questions to ask. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I'd like to invite now Arthur Sweetman to please discuss your chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, John and Margaret, for what you've said so far. John, for your introduction, and Margaret for bringing this whole book together. So in my chapter, I'm deviating a little bit from many of the other chapters in the sense that I'm putting forward one concrete proposal that I hope will address a small corner of the problem that Canada and the world faces in terms of the international migration of health professionals. Oops, there we go. So right now, we have this odd story of shortages. Margaret at the beginning talked to us about shortages in various developed countries. In fact, the shortages of health professionals are much more severe in less developed countries. The OECD and the World Health Organization, the WHO, calls it a crisis. And as John mentioned, the WHO promulgated a global code of practice on the international recruitment of health personnel, which there was a lot of fanfare when it was first brought in and not much discussion subsequently, which I think is quite unfortunate. And in Canada, we have a particular problem that I think is very much the kind of problem that the WHO was worried about in discussions around its global code. And that is that Canada has simultaneously both shortages and surpluses of individuals credentialed in key health professions. We have shortages of practicing people in particular locations, in particular jobs. We also simultaneously have surpluses of individuals waiting for credential recognition. And part of this has to do with the credentialing process itself, but part of it is a much broader issue. And I should say that many of the people waiting for credentialing who may never be credentialed, many of these people will indeed never be credentialed in the Canadian context, come from global regions facing healthcare personnel shortages. So there really is a moral crisis in Canada that we haven't discussed very much in terms of our approach to international recruitment. So there have been calls recently to speed up licensure processes for internationally educated health professionals as a solution for Canada, and that probably in the short run does benefit Canada to some degree, but it doesn't address the bigger questions. And I think for the bigger picture, Canada would benefit from jointly thinking about or jointly coordinating immigration, labor requirements in the healthcare market, skill requirements in the healthcare market. And we have to be very careful that labor requirements and skill requirements are not the same thing. We need to think about licensure as part of that. There seems to be a big focus, especially in the media, about licensure, but it's only one small part of a very big picture. And then we need to think about internationally trained health workers and how they're integrated into the Canadian labor market. And I think we really need to think of this as a pathway on the immigrant side, not as a set of distinct and isolated bits, but as a puzzle where you need all the pieces of the puzzle to fit together in order to be able to see the picture. And so the problem, or one of the problems we face in Canada, is that in our federation, immigration, health professional credential assessment, and health workforce planning cross federal provincial lines of responsibility. And we are particularly bad at coordinating policy issues, or in fact, operational issues in the public sector that cross these federal provincial lines of responsibility. The coordination problem seems to be too large, at least too large to have been solved in the, how many years have we been working on it now as a nation, roughly 150. We haven't solved it yet. And I'm suggesting one way to try to address this problem. And as background, and the chapter goes into a lot of detail about this, labor markets for health professionals are different from what I'm going to call normal private sector ones. And I only call it normal because it's the kind of thing we talk about in first-year undergraduate economics courses. It's not really normal in any other sense. The key thing for healthcare is that for many occupations, provincial governments are the only employer or payer. And in situations where provincial governments are not the only employer or payer, provincial governments regulate and federal and provincial governments subsidize almost every single health profession. So these are not normal labor markets. And these are not normal, what I'm going to call service markets or product markets either. They don't adjust automatically to shocks the way the private sector might. We need a different policy approach than the policy approaches in the private sector. And I don't think this is realized as thoroughly as it needs to be. So one policy solution that's been proposed, and in fact has been proposed a long time ago and is underway, is improved regulation of regulators and anti-discrimination policies for new hires and new entrants to the Canadian labor market in health professions. And a big example of this are the fairness commissioners that 3 provinces in Canada brought forward, and other provinces have taken similar actions by other means. They can do an excellent job in reducing discriminatory barriers at the regulatory stage, but they're too late for the immigration stage. They don't really address the who's concerns at all, and they don't do anything for workforce planning. So again, this is a policy answer, a good policy answer for one tiny piece of the big puzzle. So I'm suggesting a second policy solution, which tries to tie these pieces together a little bit. And the chapter goes into a lot more detail about how this would work and why it matters. One of the key problems at the moment, in my view, is that federal immigrant selection policy does not work for occupations that are provincially regulated and where the workers are provincially employed or paid. And this includes physicians and nurses, but it also includes teachers and social workers. There's a large number of professions in our society where the province is de facto the only employer. Better pre-migration information is helping on this front. That is to say, it's letting people understand what provinces require, but it's not, it doesn't really address the problem, the whole picture. So the proposal is to move provincially funded occupations, especially health occupations, out of federal immigration streams and to move them into a provincial immigration stream. To introduce and subsequently, or at the same time, introduce screens for federal economic immigration streams to prevent those wanting to work in provincial occupations from entering without an employment offer. So the idea here is simple, is to reduce the coordination problems between orders of government and to put the tools, and I didn't put it on the slide, but I'll say it out loud, put the responsibility in the hands of the order of government with primary constitutional responsibility. So right now, provincial governments have constitutional responsibility for healthcare, but they don't have all the tools because they don't have control of the immigration process. So this is not a perfect solution. It clearly has some problems. Interprovincial mobility undoes some of it. Some credentialed individuals enter in streams other than the economic class, which are a bit harder to control. So family class, refugee class, et cetera. And it doesn't solve the backlog. But I think in the long term, it would be an improvement. It lets provincial governments take immigration responsibility where they have employer-payer responsibility. And importantly, it reduces what I'm going to call the non-use of skills in Canada of people who immigrate to Canada. And this has this not only improves the outcomes for those new arrivals, but it also simultaneously addresses some of the WHO goals. So again, the goal here is it's a policy proposal for a large, in some sense, change in terms of immigration policy in order to make the focus of responsibility for health workforce planning much clearer, much more structured, much more focused on the provincial governments themselves. And because I think one of the things we need here is much improved health workforce planning. And this is about one aspect of that improved health workforce planning, focusing on immigration admission. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Arthur. Ivy, you are next, please.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Margaret, for inviting us to submit a chapter to this book. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to showcase that chapter in this webinar. So really appreciate that. So the chapter that I led in this text is chapter 5, Gendering Immigration Pathways, Migrating Health Professionals to Canada, that I undertook in collaboration with colleagues Jelena Atanakovic and Elena Nieterman. And just a quick note that I'm situated in Ottawa, or Odawa, the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I do like to pay respect for that. And hopefully my next slide will go. There we go. Oops, went a bit too fast. So the overview of the chapter is, so we're trying to make a case quite specifically for the growing recognition of the important role that gender plays in the integration of migrating health professionals. This is unsurprising given that globally, 70% of the health workforce identifies women, and here in Canada, over 80%. And so we try to tease apart in this chapter some of the gendered influences on the integration processes of migrating health professionals. And it's based on a review of the literature and on some of our own research, which we focused on different and unique pathways integration from bridging programs, international students, and stepping stones through older adult care. As I mentioned, our analysis is informed by a conceptual framework that teases apart migration from integration processes. And Arthur gave us a really nice description about all of the inputs into migration processes. In this chapter, we're focusing quite specifically on integration. So this is a framework that comes from a previous chapter where we also make a case for an intersectional lens on all of the different processes at these different levels of analysis. So first of all, our review of the literature reveals how gender affects labor market integration of migrating health workers in their host country, so specifically here in Canada. Being of female gender exacerbates the de-skilling process or the lack of recognition of skills. So it's not so much de-skilling as the lack of recognition. This is due in part to gendered responsibilities such as family responsibilities and the economic costs, because migrating health workers who identify as women are disproportionately working in sectors with low pay. So costs associated with credential recognition really do make a difference. The delays result in poor labor market integration as well. Gendered, racialized identity and professional status also interact, making groups like racialized women nurses particularly susceptible to discrimination. And this is some research to contrast nurses' experiences of internationally educated nurses' experience of discrimination vis-a-vis internationally educated physicians. So what we see are delays, de-skilling, and discrimination that are exacerbated by those with intersecting identities of racialization and female gender. Our first case study from our own research is really coming from an empirical analysis of the role played by bridging programs in helping to address the typical de-skilling or lack of recognition of skills that occurs with migration. So these programs not only help to bridge skills to those in the host country, they can also bridge the delays in resulting in de-skilling, so the delays in recognition. So bridging programs can help improve exam responses, the ability to get a licensure, but they also enable the integration and provide knowledge that's important for the integration processes. So bridging bridges a lot of different things. What's particularly problematic in the Canadian context is the precarity of the funding of these programs. Despite showing really remarkable success rates in sort of exams, in integration, labor market integration, and these continue, the precarity of funding continue to this day. Some of the programs that we studied during the study are no longer available. And so this is an area where continued and renewed policy attention could definitely happen. Our second empirical case study is of international students. And we undertook this because there was a lot of attention to international students. And what we found is a bit of a conundrum. There's the potential in the sense that international students are recognized as bringing critical skills to the Canadian workforce. And there's also recognition that this would enable improved access to healthcare services for newcomers with whom they share language and culture. However, this is, as of yet, an untapped source because there's a policy disconnect between post-secondary institutions, regulatory authorities, and immigration policy. So this is mirrored in the immigration or the policy disconnect that Arthur revealed in the case of integrating internationally educated health professionals. So this is unfortunate. We found very few health profession education programs that were tapping into international students. Our third case study is sort of the stepping stone through older adult care. And it's a sector dominated by women as healthcare providers, also as recipients of care, and internationally educated health professionals as well. So whether integrated formally into home care services or long-term care sectors, or informally as domestic workers through the Canada Caregiver Program or its predecessor, the Live-in Caregiver Program, intersecting identities of gender, racialization, and citizenship affect their integration experiences. What we found is that workers who are coming, internationally educated workers who are coming to work in the sector are susceptible to sort of a double social exclusion. Personally, because of their poor labor market integration in roles that do not fully utilize their skills. And therefore they are remunerated at a lower rate. And at the same time, because of gendered expectations of remittances, they are personally experiencing a lot of social exclusion. Women and racialized women are more consistent and more generous in terms of remittances to the point of poverty here in the host country. So we describe this as sort of a double isolation of themselves and of their work in a sector that is all but invisible and undervalued. Well, it was particularly invisible prior to the pandemic. It has been more visible then, but it only reared its head because of the absolutely outrageous things that were happening. We saw this play out, this double isolation during the pandemic, where racialized workers in long-term care were more susceptible to becoming infected, had less access to personal protective equipment, and were more likely to die of the virus. And we had started a memorial at the Canadian Health Workforce Network website, and the photos of the workers who were dying were telling. So overall, for both international students and those who migrate with the plan to live and work in Canada, across the case studies and within the literature that we reviewed, we found that an explicit gender and indeed intersectional analysis revealed the unique factors that influence immigration and integration processes and experiences of the integration process. So going forward, we feel that it would be wise to recognize these influences explicitly in policy development, analysis, and evaluation. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ivy. Abel, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for inviting me to contribute to a chapter in this book. And I would like to preface my remarks by noting that I have been working on the issue of health worker migration from Southern Africa for about 2 decades now. And I have collaborated mostly with the Southern African Migration Program that's headed by Professor Jonathan Crash, who's based at the Basilisk School. So I couldn't resist when Margaret came to me and asked me to contribute a chapter in this book to look at the issue of migration intermediaries, because they have been vilified in most of the papers that I have written. So I just wanted to find out what changes have occurred in this migration intermediary industry over the past 2 decades, especially with the passing of the various codes of practice. So migration intermediaries still relevant in today's world? What kind of work are they still doing? So that was the main focus of this paper. So we know that countries in the global south, they are faced with a severe problem of skilled health workers. And ironically, these skilled health workers, they are moving to developed countries that offer them better living conditions, better salaries. In these countries, they also have a better supply of health professionals. So scholars in the global south, they've bemoaned this movement of the skilled health workers, describing these movements as a brain drain, and they've emphasized mostly on the impacts of these movements on the quality of healthcare, especially in the public sector. The public sector, that's the most accessible sector, especially for most people in the global south. But there are some scholars who highlight the positive impacts of these movements, citing issues such as the remittances that these health workers send to their home countries. Some, they talk about skills transfer when they return home temporarily or even virtually. And some, they argue that some of these health workers, they return to their home countries after working in the global north for a certain period of time. So caught up in this debate, these migration intermediaries who play a crucial role in health worker migration. So what are migration intermediaries? So these are basically agencies that assist the mobility of health workers. So they help them obtain visas, and they also help them enter the labor market. So help them with a job search. And they also help them with their integration. So there are some operators that provide loans to the migrant health workers so that they can settle in these host societies. So the migration intermediary operators have become the public face of the brain drain debate, because when we think of the brain drain, it's about these individuals moving from poor areas to supposedly richer areas. And there are some individuals or agencies that facilitate that. So that's why they have become the public face of this debate. So in certain writings, they have been described by pejoratives such as migration merchants, such as merchants of medical care, or as poachers, or the global raiders. Some scholars, they also argue that this brain drain, it's a catastrophe for African development, that African countries cannot continue to subsidize richer nations, and that this brain drain should be viewed as an international crime. So are these migration intermediaries good or bad actors? So some scholars, they have noted that these recruitment agencies, they stimulate migration in labor supplying countries. So basically what they are saying is that there are some individuals who would not harbor any thoughts of moving to other countries, but because of their activities, the information which they provide, and also other services that I talked about, some individuals might be encouraged to move from country X to country Y. But some scholars, they argue that we cannot blame these recruitment agencies because they are not the ones that create the desire among the health professionals to migrate. So they are just taking advantage of a situation that's already there, poor salaries, and so forth. And other scholars, they also want us to know that these individuals that we are talking about, the health workers, they are also active agents. So sometimes they seek out these recruitment agencies so that they can get the information that they need. So they are actually active actors in this process. So the first question that I had was, does the presence of these recruitment agencies help individuals move from the developing countries to developed countries? So research by Labonte and others, it showed that there is a strong correlation between contact by recruitment agencies and consideration to migrate. So in other words, individuals who have been contacted by recruitment agencies and they have this information that, okay, these are the kind of jobs that are available and we can assist you move to that country, will provide you with the funds and so forth. So those individuals who have been contacted by recruitment agencies, they are more likely to move than individuals who have not been provided with that kind of information. And over time, we are also seeing a decline, especially in organized recruitment of health workers, especially in the global north, in countries such as the US, and also in the United Kingdom. So if we look at the numbers of internationally trained professionals, in this case, Filipino nurses in the United Kingdom between 2003 and 2015, we are seeing a big decline. And one could say that that's actually associated, that's linked to the various codes of practice. And this, I will not spend a lot of time on this, but it just shows that in terms of organized recruitment, the number of recruit adverts that are being placed in the global south, they are also declining. And part of that decline also has to do with increased training opportunity, training of domestic it could be nurses, graduates in the nursing and medical field. For example, in the US, we are seeing quite a rise in those in the numbers. So these various codes of conduct of practice, they discourage active recruitment of health workers from the global south. So with those codes of conduct, could we say that migration intermediaries are still relevant today? The first point to note is that we are seeing more and more recruitment still taking place, especially towards countries that do not uphold the codes of conduct in the Gulf states, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so forth. And then even in the countries that uphold the codes of conduct, we are also seeing recruitment agencies channeling health workers towards the less visible sectors of the economy, for example, in nursing homes, long-term care homes, and so forth. And we have also seen several changes taking place in the migration intermediary business. So some, they are now rebranding themselves. Rather than being seen as agencies that aid in the poaching of nurses, doctors, and so forth, they are now changing the narratives, viewing themselves, in the case of the Filipinos, as development champions. So I will just conclude by just looking at the situation that we are faced with here in Canada, whereby we have a huge crisis in our healthcare system, in the long-term care homes and so forth. At the same time, we are a signatory to the WHO Code of Practice. So it's we wouldn't want to be seen as recruiting from the global south. But if we look at, say, the healthcare industry here in Canada, we find that especially in the prairie provinces, most of the hospitals there, they are staffed by internationally trained health workers. So right now, like others have noted, there is a strong move to fast track the licensure of foreign trained health workers so that they can plug the hole that's created in our system. So the question that I will leave you with, because I've run out of time, is will this this move to fast track the licensure of foreign trained health workers lead to a growth in the recruitment of foreign health workers and recast the spotlight on migration intermediaries? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Abel. So I believe that concludes our speakers. Margaret, would you like to come back with a few words in response to any of the discussions?
Yes, certainly, and I'm hopeful that we have time for questions from the audience. I'm very grateful to the panelists for sharing details of their work. And again, as I said at the beginning, although the book took some time in its coming to be, I do feel it's really timely considering the transformations that we've seen occur. And I might take, say, a prerogative of asking a few questions just to get things started, if that's okay. I was interested in, Abel, your presentation. You had some data. Some of it may be a few years old now. And I wondered if you had taken a look to see what the data is telling us now in terms of international recruitment and the role of agencies. I know that in the US, numbers are definitely back on the increase in terms of applicants to take the, for example, the nursing exam. So if you have some comments on where you think the numbers sit right now, and then maybe Arthur might be willing to take a moment to think about something I've asked him before, his very interesting policy suggestion, you know, what might be some of the gendered consequences of that kind of an approach. I'd be really keen to hear that. And John, I'm very grateful to John for presenting, giving us some oversight, because he is an expert in the area of global value chains. And maybe to take another moment or two to talk about some of the risks of using this commodification language when we're talking about labor. I know you brought up a very interesting contrast there between the analysis of football players and baseball players in terms of looking for their unique skill sets, but maybe a few more words in terms of that idea about homogenization. That was a very interesting comment that I think we probably all have something to say about. And then maybe Ivy, following on from that, if you might have a few words in terms of thinking about that issue of skills in terms of this notion of, you know, is it a homogenization that we seek, or is it this mapping of a set of skills from one place to another? And what are some of the gaps that might appear when we look at these bridging programs and what they attempt to do in answering that? So I hope you will allow me this opportunity to pose questions to our panelists who've been very deeply engaged with this work for some time, and I'd love to hear their thoughts.
I think just, sorry, Abel, just before you begin, we have a Q&A function. So if you are in the audience and you have some questions, please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. Okay, thank you, Abel.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, Margaret, thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to look at the recent trends, especially in data related to the movement of health professionals from the global south. Yeah, but just based on what's been going on especially over the past few years, we know that with COVID-19, there were restrictions, especially on the movement of individuals from between countries. So we know that COVID, it reduced the number of individuals crossing boundaries. So there is a good chance that, especially from the period 2022 to 2021, that the numbers of, it could be health professionals moving from the global south might have been affected because of the restrictions. But we also know that COVID-19, it also created a huge crisis in our healthcare system, that we had so many nurses and also doctors resigning from their posts because of the pressure and also the stress that was put upon them because of this disease. So that created a big gap, and that gap cannot be filled by the domestic production of nurses and doctors. So there's likely to be a huge move, especially of individuals from the global south to developed countries because of the opportunities that have been created in the labor market. So I think that's something that some scholars, some individuals should actually seek to explore, just looking at the current trends in health worker migration and how those and how COVID-19 has played into that.
Thanks. And maybe I'll ask Arthur if he'd like to comment on the question I asked.
Yeah, so it's a great question. The paper deals with it a little bit, even though my presentation didn't. It's one that we can really only speculate. There are some big changes happening in migration and in health professions right now. So we know that the largest health profession is probably nursing, and nursing is obviously female dominated in Canada. And traditionally, nursing has had a very low percentage of immigrants. In contrast, medicine in the old days was predominantly male. These days, it's pretty close to 50-50 for new entrants. And in medicine, like pharmacy, in contrast to nursing, has a very high percentage of immigrants. So the percentage of immigrants in nursing is way below the national percentage of immigrants in the population. And the percentage of immigrants in medicine is much higher than the national percentage of immigrants in the population. And so it depends in part on whether we see shifts towards a higher percentage of nurses who immigrate to Canada, which is, has not traditionally happened very much. So if we see that shift, there could be very substantial gender changes or gender balance changes in immigrant health professionals. The other thing that again, the chapter deals with this a little bit, and I didn't have time in the short presentation, is to think about the immigration stream, because in the immigration, in the economic class immigration streams, the only individuals actually assessed for skills, with some minor exceptions, are the principal applicants. And principal applicants historically have been about 80% male. That's been declining a little bit in recent years, but historically, the vast majority of principal applicants in the immigration stream are males. And so the females, in some sense, are what economists sometimes call tide movers. Right? So you move because of the principal applicants' occupational opportunities, and the tide mover, in some sense, comes along and takes whatever they can. And again, the question is, how much is that going to change over time? How much are women in the future going to become increasingly likely to be the principal applicant in Canada's immigration process? And is Canada's immigration process going to change? And it's made some efforts to do this a little bit in the last several years, but change to think about the way I should be careful here. I'm talking only about the economic class. I'm not talking about refugees and family class here, but to think about immigrants coming as families rather than coming as principal applicants with other individuals who tag along, right? And Canada has traditionally had this approach to immigration that principal applicants immigrate and others happen to be with them. And we're slowly, I think, starting to think about families immigrating together, and the people who tag along having labor market opportunities as well. And so there's a lot of speculation in answering your question, because we need to think about how much the government changes on this front and how much nurses as opposed to physicians migrate to Canada. So there's a whole pile of very, very interesting questions that, to be perfectly honest, it could go in one of several directions, and it's really hard to forecast which direction is going to be the actual one we take as a country. And in part, It's going to depend on the policy decisions that are made as a result of discussions that happen like the one we're having right now. Because I think those government policy decisions are not yet set in stone. They evolve over time and are subject to the influence of these types of discussions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Arthur. And on that matter of recognizing that we're talking about folks who are sort of socially embedded in families and have, those kind of family decisions frame the migration process. Maybe, John, you could say a few more words about the note of caution you articulated in terms of bringing an approach that commodifies humans, as it were, to this analysis.
Yes, thanks, Margaret. I just feel very uneasy when I read this literature that treats people as if they are widgets. And so, I mean, that's a sort of general concern that one can develop in many different ways. But I wanted to pick up on your other question, which was really about this homogenization issue. And, that really, I think, homogenization, standardization of qualifications really has two levels to it. I mean, the first is this person going to meet the migration requirements, the immigration requirements? And then secondly, is this person going to reach the licensing requirements for their profession in that country? Now, the two are often, of course, closely tied together, but they're not necessarily identical. And the extent to which one could imagine a standardization of qualifications would be one that would put let's say, a nurse in a much stronger bargaining position. If that person is trained in a way that their qualification would be recognized in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, then they have a much stronger bargaining position than if it's specific to a country, or even worse, specific to a province, so that the training is only recognized in Saskatchewan and not in Ontario, say. Now, this really comes back to this whole question of bargaining power, which is central to the discussion of value chains. And I think the greater the standardization of and recognition of qualifications internationally, then the better the bargaining power for those who actually achieve those qualifications.
Yeah, so I'll pick up from there. Margaret, thank you for the questions, and it's challenging for me not to answer some of the questions that you've posed to the other panelists. But if we're specifically looking at bridging programs and this notion of bridging skills, it highlights this disconnect that we have between occupational integration and skills integration, and Arthur made that point. And because although there is an international move towards standardization of qualifications, the old adage that a nurse is a nurse is a nurse is not true, right? So your nursing skills in Australia, in South Africa, in India, Philippines are different from here. Ergo, the reason why we have bridging programs to sort of bridge those skills. Bridging programs are very downstream. And so I do like the discussions about upstream policies. I mean, we do have a backlog of people, and I, like John, don't like, speaking of a backlog when we're talking about people who have skills and who would like to, be able to apply those skills. That's a poor return on their investment for the time and investment that they've put into their training. However, we are going to we're going to need to have a bifurcated policy for now. There's the reactive policy to deal with the folks who are here and how do we better integrate them. And then we need a policy going forward in terms of how do we better recruit more ethically, do more planning so that we aren't so reliant on always going the internationally educated health professional recruitment route. So I think there need to be a number of things in place. So it's multi-layered, and there's complexity with that. I do like this notion of Arthur's mentioning to move immigration policy into the realm of reality, that people migrate as families. I'm curious as to whether or not, if we looked specifically at healthcare, whether or not the principal applicants have traditionally been or into the future will be men. Because I know there's some very interesting analyses and what came up in the literature from Sheba George, who talked about, when women come first in the United States. So the principal applicants were women nurses from Kerala. And so I think that would be important. But this is a good example of taking gender explicitly into consideration when you're looking at policy or changes of policy. So although it's important to decouple skills from occupation, because some occupations may have certain skills, that's not internationally transferable. So I think the more that we focus on sort of the practicalities of skills, there's additional complexity with that, of course. And although I really like Arthur's suggestion of moving the decision-making closer to where the employers are in terms of healthcare to the provinces, that may not necessarily be a gender-neutral approach, because at least theoretically, federal policy and federal decision-making is supposed to take explicitly a gender-based analysis approach. It's written into the minister's mandate letter. There is not a parallel requirement in terms of different provinces or territories. Indeed, as far as I know, there aren't parallel ministries to what is now called Women and Gender Equality, which used to be Status of Women Canada. So I think with every policy suggestion that we make, we want to always take a step and say, what are the gendered inputs and outputs and implications of, moving forward. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. So just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function or raise your hand to ask a question. Margaret, did you have any follow-up points?
No, that was great. I'm very keen to hear from our audience. I know there's many folks there who are well versed in this area, so I'd like to open it up to hear their questions and have some engagement there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Margaret. Yes, once again, I'll ask if there are any questions. You can use the Q&A or simply raise your hand. Maybe I can ask a question while hopefully audience members are thinking of some questions to ask this fantastic panel. One reading I get one of my classes to do on migration is around the global care chain, and this was something that came up by just thinking of the discussions, which is this is not my area at all, and particularly the structural facets that enable people to migrate, and then that who fulfills those healthcare roles or caring functions in the home country. But I see that we have someone who has raised their hand. Dr. Hillman, you can unmute or on camera or show yourself or just unmute. Thank you. Okay.
One moment. Yeah. Can you see me now?
Great. We can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have a question about the multi-level governance Mr. Sweetman, I think, was referring to. Could you explain a bit better how the power play between the federal state and the provinces works? That would be good to know.
So I'm not sure if power play is the right word. I mean, Canada does have two levels of government, but the two levels are, of course, provincial and municipal. For the federal and provincial governments are orders of government, and neither has, in some sense, power over another, with some small exceptions for disallowance, which I don't think has been used in many, many years. So we're really talking about the levels of government in some sense being equal competitors, or equal, I don't know, competitors is maybe not the right word, but equal players, close to equal players who I view not as suffering from a power play problem right now, but suffering from a disorganization, discoordination problem right now. So I view the problem as being one of, well, I've two problems in some sense. One is coordination between the federal and provincial governments. So it's not about power, it's just about do they work and play well together? So if right now you had some university professor who was giving them marks the way you give kindergarten students marks for working and playing well together, I don't think that the federal and provincial governments would get very good marks for working and playing well together. Right? So I view that as the big problem. And not about power, but just about being human beings. The other thing, though, is on the provincial side, if you don't have all the tools, somehow you don't really focus on doing a good job about the entire spectrum of issues that are relevant here. So health workforce planning, I see as the ultimate goal that you want the provincial governments to be doing. And it's somehow they haven't pursued that with the vigor I would have liked them to pursue it with in the past several years or the past several decades. And part of that, I think, is because they can always say, or maybe it's because they honestly feel like I can't do the planning because I don't really control the immigration flows. So what I want to do is put full responsibility on the provincial governments for the immigration flows so that they have no excuse except to do good health workforce planning, right? So if they don't do it, they can't say, oh, it's the federal government messed it up because the immigration flows aren't right. It's all theirs, 100% theirs. They have 100% responsibility. They have all the tools. And I think that would improve health workforce planning, which is ultimately what we care about, if that makes any sense. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. I may have gone on a tangent and not actually answered your question. So please come back again if I've missed something.
No, that was helpful because you describe it rather as disorganization than as power play. So one would be more intentional and the other one is just, it's a bit chaotic. Thanks.
I think that chaotic is a very good phrase. You know, we have inherited the old British system where the key phrase has always been muddling through, right? And a lot of times what governments do is they muddle through, but for a modern health system with a modern workforce, a highly skilled workforce, that takes years and years of training. Muddling through just doesn't cut it. What we need is serious long-term health workforce planning. And I think my proposal is just a corner of that big issue, but it's a corner that I think is a stumbling block.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Okay, are there, did any of the panelists want to add anything in response to the question?
There
Okay.
is a question in the Q&A, Sarah.
Yep, I was just going to get to that.
Okay,
Thank you, Margaret. So there's a question to Arthur. I would like to hear your opinion about how the policy recommendation addresses one of the key problems in the field, very lengthy licensing processes and consequently untapped labor of internationally skilled health professionals. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's trickier than you might think. It is lengthy. It's most of the duration of it is not to do, how can I put this, with the credential recognition portion of it on its own. A lot of the length has to do with skill upgrading. And there are no shortcut to skill upgrading. I mean, I think everyone on this panel today teaches at a university, and I find that 4 years is too short for many of the skills I want my students to have, right? So skill upgrading takes time. And one of the big problems in credentialing is that we have some serious problems with credentials. Here, let me show you a graph, if that's okay, or a table, I should say, not a graph. Now, these are a little bit old, not too old. Here, can I share my screen once again? Sorry, I'm having trouble looking at the screen at the same time that I'm doing this. Here, just a second. Let me share a screen. Where's the right one? There we go. Okay, so these are licensure exam pass rates for first-time takers for various regulated professions, comparing the Canadian and foreign trained. So at the time, I might be going beyond your question here. I hope I'm not. I think it's interesting anyway. But you can see here for physicians, this is from 2011. As I said, this is not up to date, but it hasn't changed all that much. The MCC Medical Council of Canada QE1 Part 1 or QE Part 1, Canadian trained 99% success rate, foreign trained 68% success rate. QE Part 2, 92% success rate for the Canadian trained, 38% for the foreign trained. If we look at registered nurses, now registered nurses has changed, right? Because the Canadians have basically adopted the American test. So we moved from having our own national test to having one, I'll call it North American test, although it doesn't really include Mexico. But anyway, so our test has changed. But anyway, so 86% or 87% of nurses passed in 2011 if they're Canadian trained, less than 50% if they're foreign trained. So a lot of the stories we hear about credential recognition taking time is really about people preparing for tests, and subsequent to preparing for the test, sometimes failing, sometimes having to retake the tests. So I have some other numbers, I won't show them to you, about people taking the test second times, third times, fourth times. And there's a lot of human capital accumulation that's required, and human capital accumulation is timely. And then if you read, for example, there's a not very well known, but I think should be better known article in the Pakistani Medical Journal, giving advice to people, to physicians in Pakistan who are thinking of immigrating to Canada. And they do a study of people in Canada from Pakistan and from similar countries. And they argue that the most time-consuming part of it for them was not the stuff I just showed. It was passing the language test before they were even eligible to write the subject matter tests. So the process that people complain about is not about the half day it takes to write the test. It's about the weeks and months and years it takes to study for the language test if that's required, and subsequent to study for the test, to fail the test, to rewrite the test again, to study for the test. That's very time consuming. And that's where in my talk I was saying some pre-migration information is really helpful, because it gets people to understand what the standard is before they arrive, and stops, people who don't meet the standard know that they can start studying, years before they immigrate. So it's a much more complicated than newspapers would lead you to believe. It's a very complicated system. And, I think the fairness commissioners and other similar processes are doing a very good job of removing discriminatory elements from the registration system, but they can't solve the fundamental problem of some people not passing what we perceive to be, at least we think, are relatively unbiased tests. There's no such thing as a perfectly unbiased test, but a relatively unbiased test. So I hope that answers the question. I hope I didn't go on too much of a tangent.
If I could just add, I think the more that we understand the different pathways and the different policies and the different offices, governments, etc., that have jurisdiction over those elements of the pathways, the better off we are. Because right now the policy focus has been on a particular point, the licensure process, and that's at the end, not fully at the end, but very near to the end of that pathway. There's an immigration pathway and all of the inputs and what affects that. And so this proposal that Arthur has put forward helps with that. There's the credential recognition licensure pathway, and that has a variety of different elements. Do we recognize your credential? Can you pass the exam? Do you have the language, the profession-specific language? Do you have the skills that are associated with that particular occupation in this jurisdiction? And we can't even say Canada, right? Because that's provincially or territorially regulated. So what you can do in Alberta might be very different than in Quebec and in British Columbia, etc. And then the next layer is, what is the backlog between the provincial licensure. And again, that can be very different across professions, across jurisdictions. And the more that we map out those different processes, we understand where the bottlenecks are in order of the different outcomes. There's credential recognition, there's getting a license, there's, passing all of these different steps. And then there's the actual integration and are you hired? What we found when we mapped that out for internationally educated physicians, that the biggest bottleneck was the number of residency positions. And so you could assist with all of those other elements, but ultimately there was not going to be an increase or more residency positions. And that was really the rate limiting part of this whole puzzle. And so the more that policy people understand where they are at in that policy pathway, in that integration pathway, I think the better off we are. So that requires people, to come together, to be at a table. I thought, when there was the multi-level foreign credential recognition program, I thought that it brought a lot of different people to the table, but that doesn't necessarily just need to be at the federal level. It needs to be provincial, territorial, employers, regulatory authorities, educational institutions that, support the bridging programs. That's all I'd say.
Thank you very much, Ivy. So I think I see no more questions. I think we'll draw the session to a close. I think, well, Margaret, I was going to suggest going in reverse order so that we can end with you. I don't know if that's okay. Yeah, so I'd like to invite Abel to offer any closing thoughts you may have. Just need to unmute there. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was just trying to relate my chapter to other chapters, because I was just looking at the movement of health workers from the global south and also the channels that they are using to get there. So we need to recognize that these individuals are coming from low supply environments, low supply areas. So these countries, they're actually facing a big problem of health worker shortages. So these guys, they move to our countries, but they cannot practice. So I think that actually raises some moral issues, some ethical issues. I think, Margaret, you have written on a paper on that issue. So I think that's something that as a country, Canada needs to address, that disconnect that Arthur talked about, that we allow such individuals to come in here and then we end up having what we call brain waste, because these individuals, they end up working in those many positions where their skills are not utilized at all. So I think there is actually scope for Canada to do better as a country, to make sure that individuals who are allowed to come in to the country as skilled professionals, they have the opportunity to engage in jobs that they are qualified for. So I think those are my closing words.
Thank you so much, Abel. Ivy.
I think I've added my comments, but I just really want to reiterate the importance of this topic, the importance of taking an explicit gender and indeed an intersectional lens on this topic, and really try to tease apart the multiple layers of complexity so that we can start addressing policy that is mindful of all of the other layers and other intersecting influences. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Ivy. Arthur.
So in large part, I would just repeat what Abel said. I mean, I think he and I are saying the same thing from two different directions. If people come to Canada, we want to make sure that the skills are used. Right now, there are massive queues of credentialed physicians who are not licensed to practice in Canada. There's a large population of such people, and it's a real waste to the countries from which they came. So I think that's a real problem. I view that as a moral problem, an economic problem, a social problem. It has all those labels. And it's one that I think we need to try to do something to fix. I have one proposal for fixing one corner of it, but it's only one corner of it.
Thank you very much, Arthur. John.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to take up something that you mentioned but didn't have a chance to develop, and that was the literature on global care chains. Now, I do discuss this in the chapter. I didn't have a chance to do it today because of time constraints. But I mean, it is an important application of the value chain concept to this area. And what is unique about it is that it focuses on households. And if one goes back to the origins of this literature in these global commodity chains, world systems analysis, then that literature took the chain starting right from the household and put an emphasis there on unpaid work as well as paid work. And this, of course, comes out in this concept of global care chains, Nicola Yates' work. The problem, however, for economics is that if the work is unpaid, then it's very difficult to count it, and it's usually just omitted from regular statistical analysis. And this is even more so where Yates gets into discussions about caring about emotional support, that is, as well as the physical caring for dimensions of care chains. I mean, all that really I can do here is recommend to people that they have a look at this work if they haven't done so already, because it really is important in bringing in different dimensions, and in particular, emphasizing the gender dimension of all of this.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, and if I can just add very quickly, I think also linking, say, us in Canada to that might be needing healthcare to people in other countries and their families, and making those connections, I think, are also important. So thank you for speaking to that. Margaret.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity to kind of wrap up the book launch, as it were. And I'd like to thank again the panelists and all of the contributors to this volume. And I'm, again, I'm very pleased when we have this kind of discussion to recognize the timeliness of this work, because what the collection does is it touches on all of these issues. So in this panel, what we've done is we've looked at this as a very much an applied policy issue, where there are actions that can be taken by different levels of government, by different groups. We've recognized the complexity of the actors involved, indeed the complexity of the process involved. We've also recognized the significance of the matter, and that's also a very important dimension of the collection that I'm very pleased to see is present and meaningful at this point in time. And again, the continuation of the recognition of the conceptual interests that we have in terms of these different models that bring in different kind of political economy and economist debates in conversation with feminist literature that examines the issue of care. And as John and Ivy and Abel and Arthur have mentioned, there are many dimensions to this that need to prioritize the role of the household, the role of ethics, the role of morality, also the issue of care and gender, the household. There is a host of important literature that has not necessarily come into dialogue. And so the collection tries to do all of those things. However well, will be down to those of you who want to engage with the work. I hope some of you will be interested enough to perhaps follow up. But I should just say I'm very grateful for those who've contributed to the collection. I'm pleased to see it's come out at a time when it does offer something significant, and for a particular issue a very particular issue that we're looking at globally right now in wake of the pandemic and the significance we've recognized in terms of health systems, the sustainability of health systems, the resilience of health systems, and the necessity to protect healthcare workers, but also to engage in much more careful planning. And I think, you know, Arthur's comment about muddling through is not good enough. It's not going to cut it anymore. And so many of the panelists here have been doing amazing work in that regard. I would encourage you to look at the work of each of them in more detail, and also to engage with the volume. And I'd like to just say thank you again to everyone for attending.